was in print in 2013. She wrote many other papers in epistemology. She's also been working, however, both in logic and in philosophical logic and in philosophy of language. For example, she has a very nice piece on the word therefore in analysis, but there's much more to that. She is working towards a book called The Practical Mind. Is that still the title, The Practical Mind? And you can read sort of a program, a project for that book in her academia page. So today she will be speaking about reasoning and presuppositions. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes. It's actually my first time at the SIFA. I get to be the plenary speaker. I don't think it's quite fair, but I'm going to play along and pretend it's fine for me to deliver a talk in front of this many people. So today I'm going to talk about reasoning because the FINO graduate conference is just ending with this talk. I had the topic of reasoning, and I took the topic very seriously. So I'm going to give you the highlights of a theory of reasoning that I've been developing. In order to start, I would like to begin with a platitude, something completely uncontroversial. When we reason, we often take things for granted. Sometimes we are warranted in taking those things for granted. Sometimes we are not warranted in taking those things for granted. Let me give you some example. Suppose you reason from the fact that there are no ongoing epidemic crises to the conclusion that there's no need for vaccines. We can all agree this is a terrible argument. And it's a terrible argument because it takes for granted that the only use for vaccines is to cure rather than to prevent epidemic crises. Here is another terrible argument. Suppose I reason from the fact that women tend to drop out of philosophy more often than men, to the conclusion that, therefore, women tend to be less interested in philosophy or less philosophically smart than men. There is also a terrible argument because it takes for granted that there are now much more plausible, independently motivated explanations for the shortage of women in philosophy, shortage of role models, social pressure and stereotypes, misogyny of various sorts. Now, these are all examples where we take things for granted and we are not warranted. But often in reasoning, we take things for granted that we have plenty of warrant for. So for example, suppose I reason from the fact that there's a zebra-looking animal in front of me to there being a zebra in front of me. I'm taking for granted that things are as they look, and we are totally warranted in taking that for granted in many circumstances, ordinary life. Here is another example. Suppose I reason from the fact that this substance turned litmus paper red to the conclusion that the substance is an acid. Here I'm taking for granted certain tests for acidity, and chemists are warranted in taking that for granted. So we often take things for granted when we reason, and sometimes we're warranted, sometimes we are not warranted. And yet, you may think that at least in ideal circumstances, when we are not pressed by time, lack of focus, lack of energy, we can always spell out whatever that is implicit in our reasoning in the form of premises. And so we can always, in ideal circumstances, reason in a way that doesn't take anything for granted. It's a natural thought. I call it explicitness. It's a thought that presupposition-less reasoning is possible. It's a thought that, at least in ideal circumstances, we can reason without taking anything for granted. right. Explicitness is a kind of reassuring thought, a comforting thought, because it tells us that we can always, in principle, inspect our reasoning and by making explicit all the assumptions that it relies on. In fact, this need for assurance is to be found in the work of many prominent philosophers in the analytic tradition. Definitely we find it in Frege. In Basic Laws of Arithmetic, Frege tells us that it cannot be demanded that everything be proved, because that's impossible. But we can require that all proposition used without a proof be expressly declared as such, so that we can see distinctly what the whole structure rests upon. In the exchange between Hilbert and Frege, Hilbert tells us, in axiomatizing geometry, I don't want to presuppose anything as known. In axiomatizing informal theory, we seek to make explicit assumptions on which it depends, separating out a set of axioms from which the whole theory unfolds logically, allows us to focus our assessment of the theory and its justificational ground on the axioms alone. Even beyond philosophy and mathematics, people have voiced the idea that we have to be able to reason without taking anything for granted. For example, you find it in the thought of Paul Grice in Aspects of Reason. He gives a theory of reasoning, according to which to every instance of ordinary reasoning, there corresponds an idea reasoning that spell out everything that is implicit in the former, and so that you can understand the validity of the informal actual reasoning in terms of the formal validity of the idea reasoning. So explicitness is a comforting thought and something that definitely is in the back of the mind of many prominent philosophers. But is it really true that presupposition and reasoning is possible? So today I'm going to provide an argument for thinking that's not true. Reasoning is constitutively presuppositional. I'm going to suggest there cannot be reasoning that doesn't take something for granted. How I'm going to argue for that? Well, I'm going to suggest that that's one of the main lessons of a long-standing paradox of inference and reasoning that's known as Lewis Carroll regress of the premises. Many philosophers have thought that that paradox tells us something constitutive about reasoning and inference. Oh, okay, thank you. What I'm going to suggest is that the moral is not quite the one that these philosophers take the regress to teach us. Right. Now, before I start with the argument, though, I want to give some preliminaries on kind of the methodology that I'm using here. By everybody's lights, reasoning is a psychological process of some sort. And you may worry that philosophers may not be entitled to give theories of reasoning, tell us what reasoning constitutively is. Last time we checked, Carlotta, you didn't have a PhD in psychology, and that's true. And so it's important to get clear about what the endeavor is. And here is how I'm thinking of things. So there's something that David Marr taught us, that a certain cognitive task can be studied at different levels of analysis and perspectives. You can address it at the level of the task. So you may ask what a task the register performs, calculating a bill, and so on. You may ask how the system performs the task. That's the algorithmic level. And there's implementation level of how the algorithm are implemented in the brain or in the mechanism. Now, when it comes to reasoning, you can also draw this distinction, and you can ask what reasoning is. At that level, what you want is a theory of reasoning that demarcates reasoning from other cognitive tasks that are not reasoning, and for other processes that are not reasoning processes. You also want to spell out the function of reasoning, the cognitive economy, the goal of reasoning, tell us how it is that at least in good circumstances, ideal circumstances, we can get justified belief, and when things go well, knowledge. That's the level of the task analysis. Now, for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, psychologists do tell us about the algorithmic level, the level of representation and algorithm. They tell us how it is that we reason, and sometimes, in fact, I'm going to give an example of that later in my talk. Sometimes they do presuppose a certain notion of reasoning. They do presuppose a certain answer to the task level of analysis. Now, why is it important for philosophers or for psychologists to think about the task level? Why cannot we just be content with the algorithmic level? Well, suppose we have a notion of reasoning that does very well at demarcating reasoning from other tasks that are not reasoning, and are telling us what the function and goal of reasoning is. But suppose that notion of reasoning is also presupposed by the psychological theories, certain psychological theories. Right? But suppose that notion of reasoning faces a paradox, or at least seems to face a paradox. Then of course that would threaten undermining the psychological theories that rely on the notion of reasoning, that presuppose the notion of reasoning. So by rescuing the notion of reason from a paradox, we can thereby provide a validation of foundation to the psychological theories that operate at algorithmic level. That's the idea, that's the project. That's why it's important to indulge in the question of what reasoning is constitutively. And these sort of foundational projects are projects for philosophers. They're very equipped to do that. Right? All right, so this is the plan then. What I'm going to do is to build up to a theory of reasoning that I think is the best currently available at answering the level of the task question, what reasoning is constitutively. It's very good at demarcating reasoning from other cognitive tasks that are not reasoning, and from other causal processes that are not reasoning. Then I'll show how that notion of reasoning faces a foundational problem, which is a version of Lewis Carroll regress of the premises. And then I'm going to argue that the Eastern solutions are not satisfactory and motivate a third one. Right? Motivating a third one will require seeing that committing ourselves to the claim that reasoning is constitutively presuppositional, and then if there is time, I'm going to say something about the upshots at the end. Right? All right. Thank you. Okay, so what is reasoning? So I'm going to assume throughout, without argument, that reasoning is a causal process of some sort. There are people that deny that, believe it or not, but I'm not going to indulge with those views. I don't have time to talk about those. Okay, so the question, as I see it, is what kind of causal process reasoning is. Right? And there is a very simple causal analysis that we owe to David Armstrong in the late 60s, according to which reasoning from a premise to a conclusion is a matter of one's belief state that as the premise is a content to cause a belief in the conclusion. Right? So this view is very simple and simplified because it doesn't account for cases where, for example, I come to a conclusion, realize that the conclusion is incompatible with what I already believe, and that lead me to deny the belief in the premises. So it doesn't really, because here the doxastic state is a state of belief. So we may want to weaken that to something like acceptance, a kind of less demanding doxastic state. But I'm going to play along with Armstrong's suggestion and talk about belief, but this is a simplification though. All right. Now, this is a very simple causal analysis. It's just a causal process between belief states. Right? With belief in the premises, the cause in the belief in the conclusion. And you may think, well, could that be the right view? So as I see it, there are at least two problems with this view. The first problem is that there are plenty of causal processes that don't qualify as reasoning, but this view predicts our cases of reasoning. Right? So it's not essentially adequate. So the problem of deviant causal chains, I see a lean, this causes me to believe that I'm seeing a lean, which causes me to drop the coffee I've been holding, which causes a stain on my shirt, which leads me to believe that my shirt is stained. It's a causal process between belief states, but that's not reasoning. You can fix that just by requiring that the causal process is not deviant. There's still plenty of causal processes that this view doesn't account for, and that this view predicts that are actually cases of, incorrectly, they're actually cases of reasoning. So, for example, the cases of association, suppose I'm depressive and my current thought that I'm having so much fun causes regularly my judging that there's so much suffering in the world as an association. So this is also not a case of reasoning, right, but it's causal relation. Or take a kind of variant of Pascal-Wager example. Suppose my belief, I come to believe that a belief in the afterlife will be beneficial, and that just causes me to believe that it's God, because I'm very sensitive to that consideration of benefit and so on. I have a reason that there is God from the belief that's beneficial, but this is a causal process. Right? Okay, so this is a problem of existential adequacy of the view, that the simple causal analysis predicts that certain causal processes are reason when they're not. Right? But I think there is a more serious problem, especially for epistemologists here. The simple causal analysis is not compatible with how we epistemically assess reasoning. As I started, I was trying to explain how when we address the task level analysis of reasoning, we want to spell out a notion of reasoning that can play a role in the cognitive economy of the reasoner, and that can explain, for example, how in good circumstances we can get justified belief out of it. So we want a theory of reasoning that tells us that reasoning is something that can be epistemically assessed, that in good circumstances at least gives us knowledge. Now, there are at least three dimensions under which reasoning can be assessed. You can assess the truth of the premises and the justification. You can assess whether the premises support the conclusion. In deductive arguments, support is entailment, and in the abductive, inductive argument, something we can like probabilistic support. But we can also assess reasoning for whether it's justified or not. And the last two dimensions, support and justifiedness, can come apart. Let me show you an example of that. Suppose I reason from A to B. So we know, thanks to Fermat's theorem, that this inference is reliably truth-preserving. But suppose I reach the conclusion just by luck, with no knowledge of Fermat's theorem, just like I had a lucky guess, right? So in this case, there is support of the premises, of the conclusion by the premises, but there's no justification. So it's an instance of reasoning that doesn't have in an instance in which reasoning doesn't come out, doesn't give rise to true belief, right? To justify belief. As an example of the same phenomenon, so suppose Tom believes that certain spots on people's face indicates that they may have been marked by a demon, and so marked, they will soon die. Tom sees spots on Bob's face. As a result of his theoretical beliefs, he takes it that the spots on Bob's face support the conclusion that Bob will soon die. Does he reason from the premise that Bob has spots of such and such sort on his face to the conclusion they will soon die? As it happens, the spots on Bob's face are a sign of an advanced disease, and so the present does in fact indicate that Bob will soon die, though for reason that Tom has no inkling of. Again, we have a support of the premises for the conclusion, but the inference is not justified because Tom has crazy views about why the premises support the conclusion. All right, so then the problem for the simple cause analysis is that it's not really intelligible on the simple cause analysis why it is that we can assess reasoning epistemically in the way I described. Because in the simple cause analysis, reason is just a matter of a causal process between belief and belief. And then, given that I believe certain premises, I couldn't but hold the belief in the conclusion. Right? There's no choice that I have. Right? So in this sense, it's not up to me. It's not something that I can be blameworthy for if I believe the conclusion, epistemically or otherwise. So this causal process view, a simple causal analysis, so the sort that Armstrong favors, really makes it little intelligible how it is that reasoning is connected to epistemic accessibility in the way it is. If you care about the role that reasoning plays in epistemology, you should be worried about that. All right. So the long tradition of philosophers, going back to Frege, think that reasoning requires something more than just a causal process, a simple causal process. It requires what they call the taking condition. The idea here is that if I reason from premises to conclusion, part of the reasoning requires me to take the premises to be consideration in favor of the conclusion. The idea is that reason is a matter of seeing that certain consideration are consideration for the conclusion, and that's true for deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, but also in the case of practical reasoning, the sort of reasoning that philosophers think give rise to intentions and plans. In those cases, it seems that it's crucial to reasoning that we take certain consideration in favor of forming intentions or plans. So this is a long tradition of philosophers that thought that, for the record, Frege, Grice. Actually, Longino is the first one that calls it taking condition, but people just credit Bogossian with that. And Judy Thompson, too, said that before. All right, so now suppose we take this idea that the taking condition is crucial to reasoning and we complicate the causal process analysis a little further, right? So in this view, we have still a causal process from a belief premises to the conclusion, but the causal process is mediated by this taking condition, so there's kind of intermediary. And that's, so on this view then, a slightly complex view, reasoning from premise to conclusion is a causal process whereby the reasoning comes to accept the conclusion from accepting the premises by taking that the premises supports the conclusion. Okay, so I think this is a nice theory of reasoning for several reasons. It gives us a unified account of reasoning across species while accounting for their differences. It tells us that all reasoning like deductive, inductive, abductive, and practical are all cases where the reasoning takes the premises to support the conclusion, although support may vary across species of reasoning. It is also identified reasoning with a causal transition, just the simple causal view, but at the same time avoids counterexample to the simple causal analysis. on this view, association and Pascal wager are not cases of reasoning because the reasoning does not take the premise to support a conclusion. The element is missing. And finally, explains our epistemic assessment. So it's not true in general that a causal analysis of reasoning is incompatible with its epistemic accessibility. On this view, in fact, we can explain the fact that we assess reasoning epistemically in terms of our epistemically assessing the taking condition, right? So the taking condition is just some doxastic state in virtue of which the reasoner takes the premise to support the conclusion, and that can be true or false. The reason can be wrong about the premise supporting conclusion, and the taking can be unwarranted or warranted. So we can epistemically assess that condition. So that means that having this view where the causal analysis is integrated with the taking condition can allow us to explain the epistemic accessibility of reasoning compatibly with the causal analysis. Right? So this is all nice and good, you might say. However, there are problems with this view. The puzzle is that it faces the aversion of the regress, Lewis Carroll regress. So start with the assumption that reasoning from a conclusion to a conclusion from belief Bn requires taking the premises to support a conclusion. This is just a taking condition. And suppose that the taking is doxastic, with some kind of doxastic state belief or acceptance. But then, what could reasoning from premises to conclusion by taking the premises to support the conclusion amount to, if not reasoning from those premises plus a further premise, the premise that the premises support the conclusion to the conclusion. So once you accept this premise 3, you just embarked in a regress, because then if you keep applying the doxastic taking, reasoning is required taking condition, taken as a premise, then you get that it's actually impossible to reason if reasoning requires a taking condition, if reasoning is the causal process that the complex causal analysis tells you it is. Right? Big problem, right? So reasoning is not impossible. It's not possible. That doesn't sound like a good conclusion. So there are at least 2 main ways of addressing this paradox. The first one is just to deny the taking condition. With this view, reasoning can be blind. It means that it really doesn't require a reasoner to take consideration in favor of a conclusion. It's not a requirement. Reasoning doesn't need that, according to this view. It's been championed by Bright and Dr. Machi. Now, of course, this sends us back to square one. What is reasoning then? How it discriminates reasoning from causal processes that are not processes of reasoning. And in fact, it's dubious that you can answer these questions correctly without invoking a taking condition and still have a fully causal notion of reasoning. In fact, Crispin Wright tries to use the notion of acting and accepting the conclusion for a reason, but that's, as he acknowledges, is not a causal notion anymore. So we have a notion of reason that is not reducible to a causal process. The most popular solution to this has been to deny the doxastic construal, the taking condition. So in this view, taking the premises support the conclusion is not a matter of having some propositional doxastic state. It's something else. It's a matter of, as they say, rule following some rule. Boghossian and Broom are the main champion of that. Now, what is following a rule? Well, it's not really that they give us the theories or that is, but The general idea is that not every causal process between belief states is an instance of reasoning, only those that are constitutively rule-governed. And so at least the view demarcates reasoning from causal process. There's no reasoning. It does well at that. However, it forfeits the explanation of why reasoning is epistemically accessible in the way it is explanation that I remember when we appealed to the taking condition. We said that taking condition actually affords that sort of explanation. On this view, after all, the taking condition is not a propositional attitude anymore. It's not something that can be epistemically assessed. So you cannot explain the epistemic accessibility of reasoning in terms of the epistemic accessibility of the taking condition anymore. In fact, I think the tests are even worse than that. On the usual construal or rule following is a matter of a disposition to act in a certain way. But as a consideration, the Kripke has taught us in his reflection on Wittgenstein rule following, just a pattern of disposition like that is not the sort of thing that can justify you when you act in accordance with it. And you can see that even just looking at the example of the depressive association. It's a causal process where the depressive person associates a nice happy thought to an unhappy thought. That causal process manifests a disposition to be depressive. But it's not the sort of thing that we would epistemically assess. All right, so what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk is to suggest that we should instead deny the third premise, the premise that the taking condition plays a role as a premise. And that means that we have to motivate the idea that the taking condition can play a role in reasoning without being a premise, can play some other role. I mean, you may wonder if this is just a problem that arises for a philosophical view. Okay. But actually, it's not just a problem that affects a weird philosophical view. For example, if you look at certain theories of explicit deductive reasoning that psychologists have put forward, like Johnson-Laird, the mental models, but also more recently his students, Clemani, and then Kahneman too. A deductive explicit piece of reasoning is a matter of the system one creating a model for the premises, and then the system two looking for counterexample to the conclusion that are consistent with the premises. So in effect, system two operates in a way similar to the taking condition. It's the version in this model that the taking condition plays at the level of task analysis. So here we have the system checking for the validity of the inference from the premise to the conclusion. Now you may ask, what's the role of the outcome of the search? Is that a premise? Well, if it's a premise, then the system one should intervene, create a model, and the deliberative system should also come along and look for counterexamples to the conclusion, consistent with the new premises. And what's the outcome of those search? Is that a premise too? Well, in that case, then the system one should come along, create a model for the premises, and system two should search for counterexamples and so on. So the same pattern of the regress arises here. And of course, these models can be implementable, so it's possible to execute them. So it has to be that the outcome of the search doesn't play the role of a premise. All right, so in order to motivate that, I'm going to look at the structure of arguments. By arguments, I mean the sort of linguistic expression of reasoning. Not because I think that language comes before the mind, but because it's actually in the context of an argument that the original version of Lewis Carroll problem arises. So we will learn from looking at that. So remember, we have Achilles, the tortoise. So I'm going to use variables because the original examples are too complicated from Lewis Carroll. So suppose we start with phi with psi. Achilles really wants to infer psi. Tortoise come along. no way you can infer psi only if I know psi, then psi. Right? It challenges the grounds that raises to a premise. But now I want to infer psi. Can I do that? Well, no way. If I know psi, and if I know psi, then psi, then psi, and so on. Right? The regress starts like that, with the tortoise challenging the ground for our Achilles, and that somehow raises the presupposition into a premise, and that's how it is that the regress is generated. A long tradition of philosophers have given us a diagnosis that I obsessed over for a long time. So Russell tells us that in response to the regress, we need, in fact, the notion of the for, which is quite different from that notion of implies. Dummett tells us that Lewis Carroll's discovery was that an argument to the form A cannot be identified with conditional. And Smiley tells us that Carroll's problem arose from his failure to distinguish between a deduction and a statement of a hypothetical proposition. Right? So there's a big distinction between arguments and conditional, but how is that not just a description of what's going on? How is that a solution, an explanation of how it is that the regress arises? Okay, so here I've been working on the semantic of the for, as Diego was saying earlier, and so it's actually interesting to look at the semantic of argument. Well, it's weird. Because the behavior of the for actually, like if you just try to explain the sort of data that Grice initially observed for the for in logical conversation, you see that the for actually works as a presupposition trigger. How so? Well, suppose, take a sentence like Jill is English and therefore she's brave, or the argument Jill is English, therefore she's brave. They both convey that her being brave follows from her being English. That's conveyed by those two constructions. However, arguably that content is not stated by those constructions. And that can be seen by the fact that it satisfies the kind of test that linguists use for presuppositions. So one test is non-additionness. For example, a sentence like "it's the name that stole the tarts" conveys that somebody stole the tarts. And the reason why that is a presupposition that is simply stated by the sentence is that you cannot directly challenge it. You can say that's not true, that's false. You can indirectly challenge it. You can say, wait a minute, nobody stole the tarts. You find the same with the for. You can say, Jill is English, therefore she's brave. That's false. If I say that's false, I won't target that her being brave follows from her being English. That's not what I'm targeting. I'm targeting the conjunction. So this is one test. But the most important test for presuppositions is the projective behavior. So presupposition is this kind of content that somehow escapes the scope of logical operators. So that what that means is that if a sentence conveys a presupposition, it still conveys it under negation as an antecedent of a conditional, or under questions and so on. So really escapes the scope of logical operators in a way that entailment doesn't. If a sentence entails something else, then the negation of the sentence won't entail that thing anymore. So this projective behavior suggests that therefore is a presupposition trigger of that sort. Right. So maybe we have a kind of popular diagnosis spelled out. Suppose an argument like phi, phi the psi, and therefore psi. Really the difference that all these people are pointing to is that the argument presupposes rather than stating that the premises support the conclusion. then it means that the structure of our arguments itself is presuppositional in an interesting way. So the victim handkerchief was found in the professor that Norton basket entails, infers, you can infer from that the professor is a murderer, and that presupposes that the premises support the conclusion. Right? But it's true also for arguments that are by modus ponens, like in this example. It means that even argument as simple as argument by modus ponens presuppose that the premises support the conclusion on this analysis. Now, why is that a pain? Well, that's really captures well the dynamic between these two characters. Like we have Achilles starting with premises and he wants to infer a conclusion, and that the tortoise challenged those grounds. Just the challenging raises the grounds to infer the premise, makes it a tissue, and then the puzzle arises again, trying to infer psi from those premises also is challenged by the tortoise, the grounds becomes a premise, and so on, right? So we have, maybe it's the presupposition structure of arguments that makes the regress possible. The regress can arise because the argument is inherently presuppositional. Okay, so let's go back to our reasoning argument. We'll be reasoning from certain premises to a conclusion by taking the premise to support the conclusion is not the same reasoning from those premises plus the taking condition to the conclusion, because they have a different presuppositional structure. So the first reasoning has B1, Bn as premises, a presupposition that B1, Bn supports C, and the conclusion C. Whereas the second one has a different presuppositional structure, so they cannot be identified. Right. All right. How much do we want time? Including this, okay, 10 minutes then? Yes. All right. All right, so now, you may wonder whether this is really something that rescue the complex causal analysis from the regress. How can taking the premise to support the conclusion be part of reasoning without being a premise? After all, you may think, if the taking condition does play a role in reasoning, that the conclusion must be based on it. But then how can, so in a sense, has to be a reason for the conclusion. How can be a reason for the conclusion without being a premise? Actually, there are plenty of reasons for conclusion. They're not premises. You know, I think the most, to me, the most convincing case is the case of implicit biases. They cause discriminatory beliefs without being necessarily premises. We don't infer discriminatory belief from implicit biases and stereotypes, but our discriminatory beliefs are actually sensitive causally to them. Or, you know, I may come to believe that it's cold because I'm freezing. I don't need to have inferred from the fact that I'm freezing that I'm cold. There's still a reason for believing that, right? And so we have a difference between a belief being explicitly evidence-based on another belief, if it's inferred from it, and a belief being implicitly evidence-based from it, if it's causally sensitive to it. And the general idea is that, I mean, it's the very act of making explicit changes the evidential relation from the content previously presupposed vis-a-vis the conclusion. There's a kind of shift in the way in which the content support the conclusion. So making it explicit, making it an issue matters also in epistemology. So, okay, so many have taken the lesson of Carroll's regress to be that reason is constitutively rule-governed, or that reason is blind. These diagnoses don't provide adequate, to my mind, analysis at the task level of reasoning, because they are not compatible with the way we epistemically assess reasoning, and they're not, obviously, at least in the case of the blind view of reasoning, not essentially adequate. Maybe the taking condition can be operative in reasoning as a presupposition, means that reasoning is presuppositional, and that demarcates the reasoning from causal processes that are not reasoning, because it still requires the taking condition, although as a presupposition, and explains the epistemic accessibility of reasoning, because as you remember, at the beginning I was talking about presuppositions that are warranted and propositions that are not warranted. So presuppositions are the kind of thing that can be epistemically assessed. But the conclusion is that, though, in a sense, it's an important sense that it's not possible to make explicit everything that is implicit in reasoning. So the idea that presupposition-less reasoning is possible is just chimerical, because if you start from reasoning one and you make explicit the presupposition from the premise and the conclusion, that will trigger another reason that will have another presupposition, and so on, infinitum. And that really kind of captures the dynamic between the tortoise and the Achilles, right? So the tortoise could keep going because there were new presuppositions created by making explicit new premises. All right, so as a price of the view, whenever we reason, we take something for granted. It means this is now fresh start reasoning. Reasoning is never neutral. In this sense, only in this sense, reasoning may be constitutively ideological. Thank you.
Yes, I believe we have about a quarter of an hour for discussion. Is that correct? Good. So, is there a microphone in the room? Okay. So he's first over there. No.
No. No. I can hear you, but I don't think everybody can hear you. Good. So I think there are at least two questions there that I like to distinguish. So one is there a regress of the presupposition? So I stopped the regress of premises, right? I did that. There was enough to stop the regress by denying the premise 3, right? So I don't have that regress. Do I have another regress? The regress of presuppositions, right? No, I don't think I do. Here's why. So, I mean, that was a little bit quick in my talk, but there's an important difference between the evidential role of premises and the evidential role of presuppositions. So, whatever relation the simple causal view imposes between the premises and the conclusion, this causal relation, that's a relation that, in my view, stands between the presupposition and the conclusion. It's a direct causal relation. Right? So you don't So the presupposition just causes, and it's something that on which the conclusion is based. And so that's the notion that Williamson has of implicitly evidence-based. Right? So that regress I don't have, because only if the relation between the presupposition and the conclusion were mediated itself by a technical condition, I would have an infinite regress of presuppositions. I don't have that, though, because it's just direct, non-deviant cause. Right? So that's one aspect of your question. Right? I don't have the regress of presupposition, but you may ask, well, there's a further regress that I haven't really talked much about, which is the regress of justification. Right? Right. So I like to distinguish between the structural version of the regress, the one that I've been talking about, that has to do with the structure of reasoning, really what causal process makes a piece of reasoning. That's one kind of regress. The other regress of justification, for me, it's the easy part. Because I do think that if you're an externalist about knowledge, you don't get that, right? It's not the kind of regress that you get because you just don't think that for a belief to be justified, it has to be given a reason for, or has to be, the reason has to be accessible to the person. You can be warranted without having this sort of justification, right? And I think there are other explanations for why we are warranted in presupposing an instance of modus ponens. One view is that we are competent believers, virtue epistemological view, that if you understand the language, you come to form correctly the belief that an instance of modus ponens is true. So that's a kind of warrant that you get on a version of a form of externalism. But also, a sort of externalism that Williamson has, in which evidence is knowledge, and evidence can be, something that is not transparent to you. The regress to justification doesn't worry me that much, because I think it doesn't, Boghossian really worries about that because an internalist about knowledge and the justification. So have I answered? Yeah. Okay, sure.
Yes, you.
Thanks a lot, Carlotta, for your talk. I was wondering about, so when you introduced the phenomenon of presupposition, you mentioned the known at-issueness, the projection. I was wondering about the capability of getting added to the common ground. So take the case of the spot and the disease. If I reason from the spot on your face that you're going to die, and I may even say something about that, like something like an argument. What is exactly, how is my presupposition being added to the common ground if it gets added to the common ground? Is it the part where my reasoning is justified on the basis that I believe in the demon getting in the picture or not?
Yeah, so, so let me first, answer by giving an example where you can actually see that it's a presupposition because you accommodate it, and so you add it to the common ground by accommodating it. So, for example, if I say Jill is English, therefore she's brave, you actually accommodate that English is brave. If you have no idea about the braveness of English people, you just have to believe that that's what you think, right? And if you don't challenge it, they will become part of the common ground, right? And it will stay there forever. Right? So that's just, one example where, it seems that you have the phenomenal combination that's so distinctive of presuppositions, you find it for too, right? In the case of the, so you were worried about the particular case of Tom and Bob? because you thought that so there would be a case where I'm not willing to accommodate, right? Because I think that it's not. We don't know that, or he doesn't know that. Suppose I'm not aware that the spots on my face support the conclusion that is dying, right? And I think he's unjustified in believing that, right? So I won't accommodate. I won't accept it as part of common ground. So yes, I think if it's nicely. I mean, of course, you will challenge it, right? You say, well, that doesn't follow. Wait a minute. That's another test that Finter gives for presupposition. Wait a minute, that won't follow, right? I shouldn't accept that. I won't take that for granted. Is that? Mm-hmm.
I was wondering whether you can say something more about the very last part of your conclusion. I mean,
I don't see you. I actually. Can you raise your hand?
Here, Giuliano.
Okay.
Ciao. So you said that, well, given that I've demonstrated that reasoning is inherently presuppositional, that means that reasoning is neutral or always it's not neutral. But I was wondering whether one might think that, well, this is not necessary. Maybe you always need a presupposition, but maybe at a certain point you will reach a kind of presupposition that is in itself content neutral. So you can spell out all the contentful, the substantive presuppositions, and then of course there will be some probably presupposition that you need for making the inference going, but that are in itself neutral with respect to the content. Yeah. So maybe the original thought was that, well, all presuppositions that are contentful can be made explicit.
Yeah, definitely. So this is, I mean, so this is a very perceptive question. I mean, it's definitely true that there's some further premises here that, in my argument, that are needed to say that reasoning is not neutral if it's presuppositional, because, as you say, presupposition can be content. It can be like just formal and empty, right? Yeah. So I don't think that's true in general. So I mean, this is part of kind of a bigger project, which I don't think that logical truths are neutral in the way in which has been thought for a long time that they were. So I don't think that even that distinguishing between, so remember when I talked about Frege at the beginning and Hilbert, they were talking about axiomatization. Does it follow that axiomatization is not possible? Maybe, of course not, it's possible. But what you have to do to axiomatize a theory is to make a choice about what to take as axioms and what to take as inference rule, which is, on my view, just a matter of licensing the system to take certain things for granted. Right? I don't think that that choice can be done in a way that's not arbitrary or not completely arbitrary. So if that's true, then it's true that, presupposing certain things. I mean, in the case of more exponents, it's such a kind of very little controversial rule, but take, negation elimination sort of intuition. So, I mean, these people, Frege really thought that it was just one logic, right? And that was neutral, right? It was kind of formal in that way. But just if you are a pluralist, you won't think that in the same way. You have to make a choice about what to presuppose. And it won't be about what you take to be empty or not, but what you take to be plausible and that you want to start from. In that sense, reason is not neutral, if you think that.
Here in front, here, first row. Thank you.
must have missed something. When you spoke about the projection behavior of presupposition triggers, I have understood that you thought that therefore is a kind of presupposition trigger, and I don't see how that is possible. First, because we don't use the therefore in questions, and then it falls under negation. So I did not understand how you could put therefore as a presupposition trigger.
So maybe
yes,
you should,
yes, you
I was
may
a little
put.
bit fast here.
Yep.
Oh, no.
Oh. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so for example, take Jill is English and therefore she's brave, right? The negation. It's not the case that Jill is English and therefore brave. It still conveys, and that was the original, guy's point. It still conveys that her being brave follows from her being English, right? Or suppose they say, is Jill English and therefore brave, right? It doesn't embed on the question. It still conveys that if she's English, she's therefore brave, right? You have to, maybe you have to think about it a moment, but it's very clear data actually. And then in the 3C, you antecedent or conditional. If I say, if Jill is English and therefore brave, she'll act as such. That also conveys that if Jill is English, she's brave. It's actually pretty strong as a data. Actually, I think that between the projection behavior and the additionness behavior, the projection behavior is clearer. The additional behavior is less clear, and because there are cases where I don't have to, for example, if I say Jill is English therefore brave, I say that doesn't follow. Seems that that's a kind of way of directly challenge it. I cannot say that's false to target the content, so that satisfies the use or non-additionness. But there are other ways of challenging it. But however, this behavior, the projective behavior, I think it's very strong. Are you convinced now? Okay. Okay. Yeah, no, sorry, I was too quick. Yeah, I was worried, yeah.
Okay, we have to stop here, I believe. Thank you, everybody.
Perché questo qui non è quello che non va?
Two small announcement. There is a password to get into the Wi-Fi system of the university. It was supposed to be projected over here, but I'm not sure whether there is anyone to project it over here. And in any case, it will be communicated in the next rooms. And now we have to move to the other building. So follow someone outside that will take you to the other buildings and to the parallel session and to the symposium, okay? Si dispiace.